The champagne cork popped at exactly 3:47 p.m., the same moment our divorce became final. I watched it happen through his live stream from my laptop in the courthouse parking lot, still wearing the navy dress I'd chosen for what should have been closure. The dress was one I'd bought for our third anniversary dinner, back when I still believed that expensive restaurants and thoughtful gestures meant something. Now it felt like wearing a costume from a play I'd never auditioned for, a role I'd been assigned without understanding the script. Instead of closure, this felt like watching my own funeral while the mourner celebrated my death. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was witnessing my marriage's public execution from the same parking lot where I'd signed the papers that officially ended it 2 hours earlier. Ethan raised his glass to the camera, his face flushed with victory and expensive wine. Behind him, his home office looked nothing like the space I'd helped him design 3 years ago. We'd spent an entire weekend painting those walls, arguing about whether sage green was too feminine for a professional workspace. I'd compromised on a neutral beige that would photograph well for video calls, never imagining those same walls would frame the spectacle of my replacement. Gone were the family photos, the picture of us at Niagara Falls during our honeymoon, the snapshot of him receiving his Business Excellence Award while I beamed proudly beside him. Gone was the wedding picture on his desk, the one where we both looked so young and certain that love was enough to overcome anything. In their place sat Madison, his 26-year-old secretary, perched on the edge of his mahogany desk like a trophy he'd finally decided to display publicly. The desk I'd refinish myself, spending hours sanding and staining the wood while Ethan complained about the smell of polyurethane. "Why can't we just buy a new one?" he'd asked repeatedly. "Because this one has character," I'd insisted, not knowing that in 3 years, the character would be someone else entirely. "To freedom," he announced to his 1,200 viewers, most of whom were probably colleagues and mutual friends witnessing the spectacle of our marriage's public execution. His voice carried that particular tone of satisfaction he reserved for moments when he felt especially clever. The same tone he'd used when explaining why my freelance design work wasn't real business, or why my concerns about our finances were emotional overreactions. To finally being able to be with the woman who actually appreciates what I do for a living, he continued, his words slurring slightly. The expensive wine had clearly been flowing for more than just the few minutes since our divorce became official. Madison giggled, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around her own champagne flute. The sound was breathy and practiced, the laugh of someone who understood that her job was to make him feel clever and important. She wore the emerald earrings I'd admired in Tiffany's window last Christmas, the ones Ethan had claimed were too expensive for someone who doesn't work. I remembered that shopping trip with painful clarity. We'd been walking through the mall after dinner, and I'd stopped to admire the window display. "Those are beautiful," I'd said, not asking for anything, just sharing a moment of appreciation for something lovely. "Maybe someday," I'd added, knowing our budget couldn't accommodate such luxuries. "Val, be realistic," he'd said, pulling me away from the window. "Those earrings cost more than most people make in a month. It's not practical for someone in your position to want things like that." My position. As if being married to him had been a job with a salary cap, rather than a partnership where we shared both struggles and successes. Now, watching Madison wear those same earrings while celebrating the end of my marriage, I understood that appreciation came with a different price tag when it wasn't attached to a marriage certificate and expectations of loyalty. The comment section scrolled past faster than I could read them, but I caught enough to understand that not everyone found this performance as charming as Ethan intended. Several former friends were expressing their disgust in real time, their digital voices creating the kind of accountability that face-to-face confrontation rarely achieved. "This is sick," wrote Jennifer Morrison, my college roommate who'd been our maid of honor. How can you broadcast this? Show some class, man, commented David Chen, his business partner's younger brother. This isn't something to celebrate publicly. But scattered among the criticism were enough encouraging comments to keep Ethan's ego inflated. You deserve happiness, someone wrote. Finally, a woman who supports her man, said another. The internet, as always, provided an audience for every possible interpretation of human behavior. Ethan seemed oblivious to the negative responses, drunk on both champagne and the sound of his own voice. He'd always been performative, but marriage had contained that tendency within the bounds of dinner parties and professional networking events. Divorce had, apparently, freed him to turn his entire life into a public spectacle. You know what the best part is? He continued, loosening his tie with the same hands that had signed our divorce papers 2 hours earlier. The tie was one I'd given him for his birthday, a subtle pattern in blues and grays that complemented his eyes. Another small betrayal in a catalog of larger ones. I don't have to pretend anymore. Don't have to act like her little hobbies matter or listen to her complain about money when she's never worked a real day in her life. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white against the black leather. The accusation stung because it was not true, but because of how expertly he'd twisted reality. My freelance graphic design work had brought in nearly $30,000 the previous year, money I'd meticulously tracked and contributed to our household expenses. But Ethan had a talent for reframing facts to serve his narrative. And in his version of our story, anything that didn't validate his importance was dismissed as irrelevant. The complaining about money comment was particularly galling. I never complained about money. I asked questions about discrepancies I'd noticed, expressed concern about unexplained expenses, suggested we might need to budget more carefully. But in Ethan's world, any woman who noticed financial irregularities was being nagging and suspicious rather than prudent and observant. But I didn't close the laptop. Not yet. I'd been waiting 6 months for this moment, and it wasn't the celebration he thought it was. Every word he spoke was being recorded, archived, preserved for the audience he didn't know he was performing for, the prosecutors, who would soon be reviewing every frame of this livestream as evidence of his character and state of mind. The story of how I discovered my husband's betrayal didn't begin with lipstick on his collar or suspicious text messages. It started with a bank statement that arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, addressed to someone named Madison Chen at our home address. The same Madison who answered his office phone with that breathy voice and who always seemed to know exactly where he was when I called. The morning had been ordinary in every other way. I'd made coffee in the French press Ethan preferred, toast with the expensive jam he insisted was worth the premium price, and had settled at our kitchen table to sort through the mail while he showered. Bills, catalogs, credit card offers, the usual detritus of modern life that somehow always needed immediate attention. Then there was the envelope that didn't belong. I'd held that envelope for 20 minutes, turning it over in my hands like it might spontaneously combust. The rational part of my mind insisted there was an innocent explanation. Mail gets misdelivered all the time. Our postal worker was new, still learning the route. Maybe it was meant for our neighbor Madison, the retired teacher who lived 3 houses down. Maybe it was a clerical error, a database mistake, something that would make perfect sense once I called the bank and explained the situation. But the envelope was addressed to Madison Chen, and our secretary's nameplate at the office read Madison Chen, and my husband had been working late every night for the past 3 months. The coincidence felt too precise to be accidental, too convenient to be innocent. I'd tried to convince myself that opening someone else's mail was wrong, possibly illegal, definitely a violation of privacy. But the envelope was delivered to my house, addressed to someone who shouldn't have any connection to our address. If it was a mistake, I'd simply call the bank and redirect it properly. If it wasn't a mistake, then I needed to know why my husband's secretary was receiving financial documents at our home. I'd opened it anyway. The account had been opened 6 weeks earlier with a deposit of $50,000. $50,000 that had somehow found its way from our joint business account to a personal savings account in Madison's name, according to the transaction history included in the statement. The same week, I'd been denied a credit limit increase because our business finances were too tight for additional risk. I'd stared at those numbers until they blurred, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The account was definitely in Madison's name, but the deposits were coming from our business account, the same account where I'd noticed smaller, unexplained withdrawals over the past several months, amounts that Ethan had dismissed as business expenses or client entertainment when I'd asked about them. The math was simple and devastating. While I'd been economizing on grocery bills and postponing dental work to keep our household expenses manageable, Ethan had been transferring tens of thousands of dollars to an account in his secretary's name. The same secretary who'd been working late with him, traveling to client meetings, and apparently sharing intimate dinners that I'd been told were networking events. That's when I started paying attention to things I'd been trained to ignore. The way Ethan's phone buzzed constantly during dinner, but never when he was in the bathroom. How our business account balance never seemed to match the invoices I helped him organize. The frequency with which Madison needed to work overtime, always on nights when I had book club or dinner with friends. I'd begun keeping a small notebook, documenting every suspicious transaction, every unexplained absence, every story that didn't quite add up. The notebook became my secret companion, hidden behind my sweaters in the bedroom closet, filled with dates and amounts and questions that I was afraid to ask directly. March 15th, $2,800 withdrawal marked client dinner, same night I was at Sarah's baby shower. No business dinner requires that much money unless it's buying more than food.
March 22nd, Ethan claimed to be at a conference in Chicago, but his location services showed him at a hotel downtown. When I asked about it, he said the conference venue had changed at the last minute. March 28th, another bank statement arrives for Madison Chen, this time $15,000 deposit from our business account, dated the same day Ethan told me we couldn't afford to repair the roof leak because cash flow was tight. The second bank statement arrived 2 weeks later, this time in a package that also contained investment account statements, showing a portfolio I'd never heard of. Madison Chen was apparently quite the successful investor, despite her $35,000 a year salary. The portfolio included stocks, bonds, and mutual funds worth nearly $100,000, all purchased with money that had originated from our business account. I'd called the investment firm, claiming to be Madison, and saying I'd lost my login information. The helpful representative had been happy to verify my identity using the phone number on file, which turned out to be Ethan's cell phone number, not Madison's. "I see here that all your account communications go to an alternate phone number," the representative had said cheerfully. "Is that still the arrangement you prefer, Miss Chen?" "Yes," I'd managed to say through a throat that felt like it was closing. "That's still correct." The phone number on file was definitely Ethan's, which meant he was not only stealing from our business, but also impersonating Madison to manage stolen funds. The crime was more elaborate and more serious than a simple affair. This was systematic financial fraud that had been carefully planned and executed over months. By April, I'd gathered enough evidence to fill a manila folder that I kept hidden behind my winter coats. Bank statements, copies of invoices that didn't match our books, credit card charges for romantic dinners I'd never attended, and jewelry I'd never received. The paper trail painted a picture of systematic embezzlement that had been going on for almost a year, possibly longer. The hardest part wasn't discovering the theft, it was pretending everything was normal while I gathered evidence. Sitting across from Ethan at dinner, listening to him complain about how tight money was, while he knew he'd transferred $20,000 to Madison's account that same week. Smiling and nodding when he explained why we couldn't afford a vacation while he was apparently financing expensive getaways for himself and his secretary. We need to be more careful with spending, he'd said one evening, reviewing our household budget with the solemnity of someone facing genuine financial hardship. Maybe you could cut back on some of your personal expenses. Those art supplies you buy, the organic groceries, it all adds up. I agreed to his suggestions, even volunteered to find additional freelance work to contribute more to our expenses, all while knowing that he was stealing more in a single month than I spent on personal expenses in an entire year. The gaslighting was so complete, so expertly executed, that there were moments when I questioned my own perception of reality. The private investigator cost me $3,000 of my own money, savings I'd accumulated from the small freelance design projects Ethan dismissed as playing with pictures. Marcus Webb looked exactly like Central Casting would order for a private detective: weathered face, kind eyes, and the patience of someone who'd seen every variation of human betrayal. Our first meeting had been in a coffee shop downtown, far from any place where Ethan might accidentally encounter us. Marcus had listened to my story without judgment, taking notes in a small leather notebook that he held with the reverence of someone who understood that details matter. "You want to know if he's having an affair," Marcus had said, after reviewing the financial documents I'd brought. "But what you've uncovered here is much more serious than adultery. This is felony embezzlement, and possibly identity theft if he's been opening accounts in her name without her knowledge." The distinction had been important. Adultery was a moral failing, a betrayal of trust that could be forgiven or forgotten depending on the people involved. But financial crimes were different. They had victims, evidence, and consequences that extended far beyond hurt feelings and broken hearts. "The question," Marcus had continued, "is whether she's a co-conspirator or another victim. That will determine how we proceed and what kind of evidence we need to gather." The photos Marcus provided were almost redundant after the financial evidence, but they completed the picture. Ethan and Madison were entering hotels, sharing intimate dinners, and shopping together with money he'd stolen from our business. In one particularly damning image, she wore a designer watch I recognized from our company's petty cash purchases, listed as office supplies in our books. But the most revealing photos were the ones taken during their shopping trips. Madison's face showed genuine surprise and delight when Ethan presented her with expensive gifts, the expression of someone receiving unexpected generosity, rather than someone collaborating in a criminal enterprise. She looked young, happy, and completely unaware that she was being photographed, or that the gifts were purchased with stolen money. "Your husband has been systematically transferring company funds to accounts he opened in her name," Marcus explained during our final meeting. "Probably thought using her identity would create distance if anyone audited the books. But that makes her an unwitting accomplice to fraud, which gives you leverage with both of them." The leverage was important, not for revenge, but for justice. If Madison was truly unaware of the financial fraud, she could become a witness rather than a defendant. Her testimony about how Ethan had convinced her to accept expensive gifts and how he'd handled their financial arrangements could be crucial evidence in any criminal prosecution. "She's young," Marcus had observed, studying the photographs. "Young and probably flattered by the attention of an older, established businessman. Classic predator behavior. Find someone vulnerable and exploit their trust." I'd nodded, feeling something cold and sharp settle in my chest. Not heartbreak exactly. That had come earlier, in smaller doses spread across months of lies and gaslighting. This was something different. Clarity, maybe. Or justice is preparing to be served. The divorce proceedings were remarkably civil on the surface. Ethan played the role of the reasonable husband dealing with an increasingly unstable wife who was struggling to accept that people grow apart. He suggested therapy, mediation, a trial separation that would give me time to work through whatever was making me so paranoid. His performance was masterful, crafted to make me appear as the unreasonable party while he maintained his image as the patient, long-suffering husband. During our mediation sessions, he spoke in measured tones about how our marriage had evolved in different directions and how he hoped we could maintain respect for each other during this difficult transition. "Val has been under a lot of stress lately," he'd explained to our mediator, his voice heavy with concern.
I think the pressure of trying to build her design business while managing our household has been overwhelming for her. She's been making accusations, questioning every financial decision, becoming suspicious of normal business activities. The mediator, a well-meaning woman in her 50s, had nodded sympathetically. "It's common for people to look for someone to blame when a marriage ends," she said gently. "Financial stress can certainly contribute to relationship breakdown." I let him maintain that narrative while my lawyer, Sarah Corner, quietly gathered documentation of every financial irregularity we'd uncovered. Sarah was the kind of attorney who spoke softly and carried a very large stick, recommended by Marcus after years of working together on similar cases. "We could file criminal charges now," Sarah had suggested during one of our strategy sessions, "but if we wait until after the divorce is final, he'll be more vulnerable. Right now, he thinks he's gotten away with everything. People make mistakes when they feel invincible." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Let Ethan think he'd won. Let him celebrate publicly, incriminate himself further, maybe even implicate Madison more directly. Meanwhile, we'd be handing over evidence to the district attorney's office with the timeline that showed systematic fraud spanning 18 months. Criminals always want to celebrate, Sarah had explained. They can't resist the urge to gloat, to prove how clever they've been. That's when they reveal information they've been careful to hide, when they admit to things they've been denying. The psychological profile made sense. Ethan had always been someone who needed validation, who required an audience for his successes. The bigger the victory, the more elaborate the celebration. Divorcing me and publicly claiming his secretary wasn't just personal satisfaction, it was professional vindication, proof that he was desirable and successful enough to trade up to a younger, more appreciative woman. "He'll probably live stream it," I'd told Sarah with grim satisfaction. "He can't resist an audience when he thinks he's being clever." The prediction had been based on years of observing Ethan's behavior. He live-streamed business victories, professional accomplishments, even minor personal achievements like completing a difficult crossword puzzle or successfully assembling furniture. The divorce and his relationship with Madison would be the ultimate validation of his worth, too significant not to share with the world. I'd been right about that. Now sitting in my car, watching my ex-husband toast his freedom while unknowingly confessing to financial crimes, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting or forgiving, but the kind that comes from knowing the truth was about to speak for itself. Ethan was mid-sentence, explaining to his viewers how he'd finally found someone who understands the importance of supporting a man's ambitions, when the doorbell rang. The sound was clearly audible through his microphone, a sharp interruption that cut through his speech like a blade through silk. He paused, champagne glass halfway to his lips, looking annoyed at the interruption. His face showed the irritation of someone whose perfect moment was being disrupted by mundane reality. "Probably some delivery," he told the camera, his voice carrying the dismissive tone he used for anything that didn't serve his immediate interests. "Madison, could you get that? I'm in the middle of something important here." The request was casual, domestic, the kind of thing a husband might ask his wife during a social gathering. It revealed more about their relationship dynamic than hours of surveillance photos could have captured. Madison wasn't just his secretary or his girlfriend. She was someone he expected to handle domestic responsibilities while he managed his public image. Madison slipped off the desk, smoothing her skirt as she walked toward the front door. She moved with the confidence of someone who belonged in that house, who'd already mentally redecorated the rooms I'd chosen and planned the life she'd stolen from me. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floors I'd selected and refinished, each step a small trespass in the home I'd created. The voices from the foyer were too distant for Ethan's microphone to pick up clearly, but I could see his expression change from annoyance to confusion to something approaching alarm. His face went through the stages of realization like a time-lapse photograph, each moment revealing a new level of understanding about what was happening. The livestream comments were asking what was happening, why he looked worried, whether everything was okay. His audience could sense the shift in energy even if they couldn't hear the conversation at the front door. Something had changed, and the viewers were hungry for drama. "Everything's fine," Ethan said to the camera, but his voice lacked conviction. "Just probably someone at the wrong address. Madison will handle it." But Madison appeared in the doorway first, her face pale and her hands shaking. The confident young woman who'd been perched on the desk moments earlier was gone, replaced by someone who looked frightened and confused. Behind her came two police officers, their uniforms crisp and their expressions professionally neutral. The older officer, a woman with graying hair and tired eyes, looked directly at the camera setup with the resignation of someone who'd interrupted too many domestic situations. She'd probably seen every variation of human drama, but a live-streamed arrest would be a new one even for her. "Ethan Morrison," she said, her voice carried clearly through his microphone. "I'm Detective Maya Lopez with the Financial Crimes Unit. We have a warrant for your arrest." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, visible and toxic and impossible to ignore. The livestream audience was witnessing something they never expected. Real-time justice being served to someone who'd been celebrating what he thought was his victory. The champagne glass slipped from his hand, hitting the hardwood floor with a crystal crash that his microphone amplified into a sound like breaking bones. The expensive champagne spread across the floor in a puddle that reflected the overhead lights, creating a small pool of golden liquid that somehow looked like blood in the artificial lighting. His face went through several colors in rapid succession: red, white, then a sickly green that suggested his expensive lunch was threatening a return appearance. The confident businessman who'd been pontificating about freedom and success was rapidly being replaced by someone who looked like he might vomit on camera. "I'm sorry, what?" he stammered, looking between the officers and the camera like he couldn't decide which audience was more important. "There must be some mistake. I haven't done anything wrong." The denial was automatic, the response of someone who'd spent months crafting whys and had begun to believe them himself. But his voice cracked on the word wrong, betraying the fear that was rapidly replacing his earlier confidence. Detective Lopez pulled out a folded paper that I recognized as an arrest warrant. Sarah had warned me this moment would come, but seeing it happen felt surreal. Like watching a movie where I somehow knew the ending but was still surprised by how perfectly the scenes unfolded. "Ethan Morrison, you are under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, and identity theft. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The Miranda rights continued as Ethan stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish pulled from water. The man who'd built his career on being articulate and persuasive had been rendered speechless by the reality of consequences he'd never imagined would reach him. The livestream comments exploded into chaos, viewers asking what was happening, whether this was some kind of joke, if someone should call for help. The chat moved so fast it was impossible to read individual messages, just a blur of confusion and excitement and disbelief. "Is this real?" someone typed. "Holy shit, he's actually getting arrested," wrote another. "This is the best live stream ever," commented a third. A few people seemed to be recording the screen, preserving this moment for posterity. The arrest of Ethan Morrison would become internet legend, shared and reshared until it reached millions of people who'd never heard of him, but would remember him as the man who got arrested during his own divorce celebration. Madison backed against the wall, her designer heels clicking nervously on the floor. She kept looking between the officers and Ethan, her confidence evaporating like champagne bubbles. The young woman who'd been giggling and toasting freedom moments earlier now looked like she was about to cry. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible through the microphone. "What's embezzlement? What identity theft?" The questions revealed her genuine confusion, supporting Marcus's assessment that she was more victim than co-conspirator. Her terror was real, the fear of someone who just discovered that her entire relationship was built on criminal activity she'd never suspected. Detective Lopez's partner, a younger man with kind eyes, turned to Madison with an expression that managed to be both sympathetic and professional. "Ma'am, we're going to need to speak with you as well. There are several bank accounts opened in your name that you may not be aware of." "Bank accounts?" Madison's voice rose to a pitch that probably hurt the livestream viewers' ears. "I don't have any bank accounts except my checking account. Ethan handles all the business finances." The admission was exactly what the prosecutors would need to hear. Madison's ignorance about the fraudulent accounts proved that Ethan was using her identity without her knowledge, elevating his crimes from embezzlement to identity theft. Her testimony would be crucial evidence in the criminal case. The detective nodded like he'd heard this story before. "We're aware that's part of what we need to discuss." Ethan found his voice as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The sound was surprisingly loud, metal against metal with a finality that seemed to echo through the microphone. "This is ridiculous. I'm a respected businessman. I pay my taxes. There's been some kind of mistake." The protests were hollow, the desperate words of someone who just realized that respect and tax compliance don't provide immunity from criminal prosecution. His voice had lost all its earlier authority, replaced by the whine of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. "The mistake," Detective Lopez said calmly, adjusting the handcuffs with practiced efficiency, "was thinking that opening accounts in someone else's name would keep you anonymous. Financial crimes investigators are quite good at following paper trails, Mr. Morrison." The irony wasn't lost on me. Ethan had always prided himself on being smarter than everyone else, more sophisticated, more strategic. He'd built his entire identity around being the kind of man who could outsmart systems and manipulate outcomes to his advantage. His business success had been built on his ability to see angles others missed, to find advantages in complex situations. Now, that same arrogance had led him to create the very evidence that would destroy him. Every fraudulent account, every forged document, every illegal transfer had created a paper trail that led directly back to him. His intelligence had become his downfall, his sophistication had made him careless, and his strategic thinking had been outmaneuvered by investigators who specialized in catching people who thought they were too smart to get caught. As they led him toward the door, Ethan twisted back toward the camera, his perfectly styled hair now disheveled and his tie askew. The businessman who'd been celebrating his freedom looked like a different person entirely. Someone smaller and more desperate than the man who'd raised a champagne glass just minutes earlier. "Val!" he shouted, as if I could somehow hear him through the live stream. "This is her doing! She's behind this! She's trying to ruin me because she can't accept that I've moved on." The accusation was typical Ethan, even in crisis. Blame someone else, play the victim, refuse to accept responsibility for his own actions. Even with handcuffs around his wrists and federal charges being read against him, he was still trying to control the narrative and cast himself as the wronged party. The officers didn't slow down, but Detective Lopez glanced back at the camera with something that might have been amusement. She'd probably heard every possible variation of denial and blame shifting during her career. Ethan's performance was neither original nor convincing. "Ma'am, you'll want to turn that off and contact a lawyer. This is being recorded and anything you say can be used as evidence." Madison scrambled for the computer, her fingers fumbling over the keyboard as she tried to end the stream. But technology, like justice, has a way of being unforgiving to people who don't understand how it works. Her panic made her clumsy, and she accidentally minimized the streaming software instead of closing it. The live stream continued for another 30 seconds, capturing her panicked breathing and the sound of car doors slamming outside. The viewers could hear her whispering, oh God," as she finally managed to end the broadcast, cutting off the connection just as the police cars were pulling away from the curb. When the screen finally went black, I closed my laptop and sat in the courthouse parking lot for a long moment, listening to the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday afternoon. Cars driving past, birds singing in the oak trees planted along the sidewalk, the distant hum of air conditioning units working against the spring heat. Normal sounds from a world that had just become slightly more just.
My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Corner. Package delivered. DA's office confirms they have everything they need. Preliminary hearing scheduled for next week. The message was brief but sufficient. Months of careful planning had culminated in this moment, and now the machinery of justice would take over. The evidence I'd gathered, the statements Marcus had collected, the financial records Sarah had organized, all of it would be presented to prosecutors who specialized in exactly this kind of case. I'd driven home through neighborhoods that looked different somehow, like I was seeing them with new eyes. The houses seemed brighter, the landscaping more intentional, the entire world somehow more real than it had been that morning. It was the difference between living in a lie and living in truth, between being deceived and being informed.
The house Ethan and I had shared sat empty now, listed for sale as part of our divorce settlement. I'd moved into a smaller place across town, a vintage bungalow with hardwood floors and windows that actually opened. It felt more like home after 2 weeks than our showcase house had after 3 years. The showcase house had been all about appearance, the right neighborhood, the right architectural style, the right furnishings to impress visitors and clients. Every decision had been made with an eye toward how it would look to other people, how it would reflect on Ethan's success and status. I'd lived there like an actress playing a role, maintaining a performance that I'd mistaken for a life. The bungalow was different, small enough that I could afford it on my own income, old enough to have character that couldn't be purchased, comfortable enough to feel like a refuge rather than a stage. The previous owners had been an elderly couple who lived there for 40 years, and their love for the place was evident in every carefully tended detail. The news coverage started that evening. Local business owner arrested for embezzlement. Live-streamed arrest goes viral. Social media users shocked by real-time fraud bust. The story had everything modern audiences craved: drama, irony, and the satisfaction of watching someone's arrogance lead to their downfall. The local news stations picked it up first, then the regional outlets, then the national media. By the end of the week, Ethan's live-streamed arrest had been viewed over 5 million times across various platforms. News anchors used it as an example of how social media could provide real-time documentation of criminal behavior. Legal experts analyzed the charges and explained how financial crimes investigations work. Marcus Webb called while I was making dinner for one, something I'd learned to enjoy rather than endure. Cooking for myself had been one of the unexpected pleasures of living alone. I could make exactly what I wanted when I wanted it, without having to consider someone else's preferences or dietary restrictions. "Thought you'd want to know the DA's office is very pleased with the evidence package," Marcus said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd seen justice served. "They're calling it one of the most well-documented fraud cases they've seen." The compliment felt good, but not in the way I'd expected. It wasn't about being right or being vindicated, but about being thorough and methodical in pursuit of truth. The skills I'd developed during my investigation, attention to details, systematic documentation, patient observation, were transferable to other areas of life. "What about Madison?" I asked, stirring pasta sauce that smelled like freedom. "Cooperating fully. Turns out she really didn't know about the accounts. Your ex-husband convinced her the gifts were from his business profits, told her he was investing her bonuses in accounts she'd access later. She was as much a victim as you were, just in a different way." I'd felt an unexpected stab of sympathy for Madison. She was young, naive, and trusted someone who'd made a career out of lying to the women who loved him. The expensive gifts and fancy dinners had been purchased with stolen money, making her an unwitting recipient of my own financial losses. "She's agreed to testify against him," Marcus continued. "Apparently she's pretty angry about being used as a front for financial crimes. Finding out that your entire relationship was based on criminal activity tends to have that effect on people." The preliminary hearing was set for 6 weeks later. By then, the viral video of Ethan's arrest had been viewed over 2 million times, spawning reaction videos, commentary pieces, and endless social media debates about karma, justice, and the dangers of live streaming your crimes. The irony was sharp.
Madison's cooperation would be crucial to convicting the man who'd claimed to love her. Her testimony about how he'd manipulated her, how he'd convinced her to accept stolen goods, how he'd used her identity without her knowledge, would provide the personal dimension that made financial crimes real to juries. I'd watched the video exactly once the night it aired, not for satisfaction or revenge, but for closure. The man on that screen, ranting about being victimized while handcuffed for victimizing others, was someone I no longer recognized. Maybe I'd never really known him at all. The realization wasn't painful anymore. During our marriage, I'd blamed myself for not understanding him better, for not being supportive enough of his ambitions, for not appreciating his success. Now I understood that the man I'd tried to understand had been a carefully constructed fiction, a performance designed to hide someone whose character was fundamentally different from what he'd presented. The divorce settlement had been finalized before his arrest, which meant the criminal charges wouldn't affect my financial recovery. Sarah had been strategic about that timing, ensuring that I'd already secured my portion of our assets before they could be frozen as evidence or seized for restitution. "You'll get everything you're entitled to," she'd assured me during our final meeting, "and he'll be responsible for paying back every penny he stole, plus penalties and legal fees. Financial crimes carry serious consequences, especially when they involve identity theft and wire fraud." The money mattered, but not in the way I'd expected. It wasn't about getting rich or getting even. It was about being made whole. The funds Ethan had stolen had been my money too, earnings from our joint business that I'd helped build through years of unpaid administrative work, bookkeeping, and client management. Recovering those funds felt like reclaiming my own labor rather than taking something that belonged to someone else. But the money wasn't really the point anymore. Sitting in my new kitchen, eating pasta I'd cooked for myself in a house that was entirely mine, I realized the real victory wasn't financial. It was the recognition that I'd been strong enough to uncover the truth, smart enough to document it properly, and patient enough to let justice work rather than settling for revenge. The woman who'd ignored suspicious bank statements and made excuses for missing money was gone. In her place sat someone who understood her own worth and wouldn't accept anything less than honesty from the people in her life. The transformation hadn't been sudden or dramatic. It had been gradual, built through small acts of courage and growing confidence in my own perceptions. My phone rang as I was finishing dinner. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar when I answered. "Mrs. Morrison? This is Madison Chen. I hope it's okay that I called. I got your number from the police report." I'd been expecting this call, though not necessarily from her directly. The young woman who'd been celebrating my divorce a few hours earlier was now facing the reality that her entire relationship had been built on criminal activity. Her voice sounded small and frightened, nothing like the confident secretary who'd answered phones and managed schedules. "It's just Val now," I said, settling into the comfortable chair I'd placed by the kitchen window. "And yes, it's okay."
"I wanted to apologize," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you probably think I'm horrible, and I understand why. I didn't know about the money, but I should have questioned where it all came from. I should have been smarter." The conversation that followed lasted almost an hour. Madison told me about the lies Ethan had fed her, the elaborate stories about business success and investment opportunities, how he'd convinced her that I was unstable, jealous, trying to sabotage his happiness because I couldn't handle his success. "He told me you were already separated when we started seeing each other," Madison explained, her voice thick with tears. "He said you were just living in the same house while the lawyers worked out the details, that you were fighting over money because you wanted more than you deserved." The lie was so perfectly crafted, so precisely designed to make Madison feel justified in pursuing a married man. Ethan had painted me as the unreasonable obstacle to his happiness,
the grasping ex-wife who refused to accept that their love had died. It was easier for Madison to believe that story than to accept that she was participating in adultery. "He made me feel special," she admitted, "like I was the first person who'd ever really understood him. He said you didn't appreciate his ambitions, that you held him back from achieving his potential." I was so stupid to believe it. "You weren't stupid," I said, surprising myself with the gentleness in my voice. "You were manipulated by someone who's very good at making people believe what he wants them to believe. I fell for it too, for much longer than you did." The parallel between our experiences was uncomfortable but undeniable. Ethan had used the same techniques on both of us: isolation, flattery, creating a sense of special connection while systematically undermining our ability to trust our own judgment. The difference was that I'd had years to normalize his behavior, while Madison had been overwhelmed by the intensity of his attention. She cried then, soft tears that I could hear through the phone. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I thought he was divorced when we started seeing each other. He told me you were separated, that you were just fighting over money." "Madison," I said, watching the sunset through my kitchen window, "he's going to try to contact you. He's going to want you to lie for him, to say you knew about the business arrangement, that the money was legitimate. Don't do it. Tell the truth, work with the prosecutors, and get yourself a good lawyer." "I already am," she said quickly. "The police detective gave me a list of attorneys who handle white-collar crime. I can't afford much, but I found someone who'll work with me on a payment plan." The conversation ended with an unexpected sense of closure. Madison wasn't the villain I had imagined. She was another victim of Ethan's elaborate deceptions. Her cooperation with law enforcement would be crucial to securing his conviction, but more importantly, it would free her from the lies that had defined their relationship. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen feeling something I hadn't expected: forgiveness. Not for Ethan, whose crimes had been calculated and deliberate, but for Madison, who'd been young and trusting and targeted by a predator who specialized in exploiting those qualities. The weeks leading up to the preliminary hearing passed quickly. I'd thrown myself into rebuilding my design business, reaching out to former clients who'd expressed interest in working with me again. The freelance income that Ethan had dismissed as playing with pictures was now supporting me entirely, proof that my work had value beyond his recognition.
The preliminary hearing arrived faster than expected. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Amanda Rodriguez, had built her case around the evidence I'd provided and the additional financial records uncovered during their investigation. "Your documentation was exceptional," she told me before the hearing began. "Most victims of financial abuse don't think to gather evidence this systematically. It's made our job significantly easier." The compliment meant more than she probably realized. For months, I'd questioned whether I was overreacting, whether the patterns I'd noticed were actually suspicious or just the result of my own paranoia. Having a prosecutor validate my investigative work confirmed that my instincts had been correct. I'd sat in the gallery, watching Ethan's public defender struggle to explain away 18 months of systematic theft. The man in the defendant's chair looked nothing like the confident businessman who'd live-streamed his victory celebration. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and his hands shook as he shuffled through papers that wouldn't save him. The transformation was striking. Prison clothing had replaced his designer suits, and the artificial confidence of his live stream had been replaced by the hunched posture of someone who'd realized that consequences were real. He looked older, smaller, diminished in ways that had nothing to do with physical appearance. Madison testified honestly, describing how Ethan had convinced her the money was legitimate business profit that he was investing on her behalf. She'd brought her own bank statements, showing that she'd never actually accessed the fraudulent accounts and had been unaware of their existence until the police explained them to her. Her testimony was compelling, not just because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Her voice shook with genuine emotion as she described feeling stupid and used, as she realized that every expensive gift had been purchased with stolen money. The jury would hear her pain and understand that she'd been victimized just as surely as I had been. The judge, a silver-haired woman with no patience for financial predators, listened to the evidence with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. Judge Patricia Hendricks had a reputation for being tough on white-collar crime, particularly cases that involved domestic betrayal. "Mr. Morrison," she said during the bond hearing, "you systematically stole from your own business, opened fraudulent accounts in another person's name, and used those funds to finance an extramarital affair. This demonstrates a level of premeditation and deception that suggests you pose a significant flight risk." The words were measured and precise, each one chosen for maximum impact. Judge Hendricks had clearly reviewed the evidence carefully and understood not just the financial crimes, but the personal betrayal they represented. Bail was set at $250,000, money Ethan no longer had access to since all his accounts had been frozen pending the investigation. His lawyer, a tired-looking man named Robert Martinez, requested a reduction, arguing that his client had ties to the community and wouldn't flee. "Your Honor," Prosecutor Rodriguez countered, "the defendant's ties to the community were apparently insufficient to prevent him from defrauding that same community. His business partners, his wife, and even his paramour were all victims of his deceptions. I see no reason to believe he wouldn't continue that pattern when facing serious criminal charges." His behavior during the livestream had shown his character clearly. Even when caught, he'd blamed others and refused to accept responsibility. Ethan was remanded to custody pending trial.
That evening, I'd driven to the ocean for the first time since our divorce was finalized. The beach was nearly empty, just a few joggers and dog walkers enjoying the sunset. I sat on a piece of driftwood that had been worn smooth by years of waves, thinking about how different my life looked now compared to 6 months ago. 6 months ago, I'd been married to a man I thought I knew, living in a house that felt like a showcase, pretending that everything was fine while my world crumbled around me. I'd been isolated, manipulated, and systematically defrauded by someone who'd promised to love and protect me. Now I was divorced, living alone, and watching my ex-husband face criminal charges for crimes I'd helped uncover. The isolation had been replaced by a growing network of supportive friends and professional colleagues. The manipulation had been replaced by clarity about my own worth and judgment. The financial fraud had been replaced by careful control over my own resources. The old me might have felt guilty about Ethan's situation. The old me had been trained to prioritize his feelings over my own reality, to make excuses for his behavior and blame myself for noticing inconsistencies. But the woman sitting on that beach felt no guilt at all. Justice wasn't revenge. It was simply the truth being acknowledged by people with the power to act on it. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a moment, I wondered if Ethan had somehow gotten access to a phone from jail, if he was going to try one more manipulation to convince me to help him. But the message was from someone unexpected. "Hi, Val. This is Marcus Webb. Wanted you to know that Detective Lopez mentioned you might be interested in victim advocacy work. There's a nonprofit that helps financial abuse survivors document their cases. They could use someone with your research skills. No pressure, just thought you might want to know the option exists." I'd stared at that message for a long time, watching the waves roll in and out with hypnotic consistency. The idea of helping other women navigate the same nightmare I'd lived through felt both terrifying and compelling. Terrifying because it meant reliving trauma, compelling because it meant transforming that trauma into something useful. The skills I'd developed during my investigation, systematic documentation, financial analysis, pattern recognition,
were exactly what other victims would need. More importantly, I understood the psychological manipulation that made financial abuse so devastating. I'd experienced the gaslighting, the isolation, the gradual erosion of confidence that made victims doubt their own perceptions. 3 weeks later, I'd attended my first training session with the Financial Abuse Recovery Network. The conference room was filled with women of all ages, all backgrounds, all united by the experience of discovering that someone they'd trusted had been systematically stealing from them. Financial abuse is one of the most underreported crimes in domestic relationships, the facilitator explained during orientation. Victims often don't realize it's happening until significant damage has been done, and even then, they frequently lack the documentation needed to prove it in court. The statistics were sobering. Nearly 99% of domestic violence cases included financial abuse, but fewer than 20% of victims ever reported it to authorities. The shame, confusion, and fear that characterize financial abuse made it one of the most hidden crimes in America.
The skills I'd developed during my own investigation turned out to be exactly what other survivors needed: how to document suspicious transactions without alerting the perpetrator, how to gather evidence systematically rather than emotionally, how to work with law enforcement and prosecutors who might not understand the complexity of financial manipulation. My first case was a woman named Jennifer, whose husband had been using her credit cards to fund his gambling addiction, while convincing her that their financial problems were caused by her overspending on groceries and children's clothes. Together, we'd trace $80,000 in hidden debt back to online casinos and sports betting sites. "I thought I was going crazy," Jennifer told me during our second meeting. "He made me feel like I was terrible with money, like I couldn't be trusted with financial decisions. Meanwhile, he was betting away our kids' college funds." Helping Jennifer gather evidence felt like completing a circle I'd started when I'd opened that first bank statement addressed to Madison Chen. Every financial record we uncovered, every fraudulent transaction we documented, every lie we exposed brought Jennifer closer to the truth and farther from the gaslighting that had convinced her she was the problem. The work was emotionally demanding, but incredibly rewarding. Each case was different in its details, but similar in its patterns: isolation, manipulation, systematic theft disguised as normal financial management. The perpetrators used the same techniques Ethan had used on me, creating confusion about money, restricting access to information, and blaming the victim for financial problems they'd secretly created. The trial was scheduled for 8 months after Ethan's arrest. By then, the prosecutor's office had uncovered additional victims: business partners he'd defrauded, vendors he'd paid with bad checks, even a charity whose fundraising accounts he'd accessed for temporary loans that were never repaid. "Your ex-husband appears to have been running a small-scale Ponzi scheme," Amanda Rodriguez explained during our pre-trial meeting. "Using money from one source to cover shortfalls in another, always staying just ahead of discovery. If you hadn't documented the pattern, he might have continued for years." The revelation was both shocking and predictable. Ethan's crimes hadn't been limited to stealing from our business and using Madison's identity. He'd been systematically defrauding anyone who trusted him with money. The scope of his criminal activity was much larger than I'd realized. The thought of other women sitting in restaurants alone on their birthdays, wondering why their husbands were working late again, not knowing they were funding their own betrayal, made my chest tight with anger. Not the hot, destructive kind of anger I'd felt during the divorce, but something colder and more useful, the kind of anger that builds nonprofits and changes laws and ensures that the next woman won't have to figure it out alone. Ethan pled guilty 3 days before the trial was scheduled to begin. His lawyer had apparently convinced him that the evidence was overwhelming and that a plea bargain was his best option for avoiding the maximum sentence. 5 years in federal prison,
Sarah Corner told me over coffee the morning after the plea hearing. Plus, full restitution to all victims, which totals just over $400,000. He'll be bankrupt and unemployed when he gets out. The sentence felt appropriate, but not satisfying. 5 years would give him time to think about his choices, but it wouldn't undo the damage he caused to his victims. The restitution would help financially, but it couldn't restore the trust he'd destroyed or repair the relationships he'd damaged.
That evening, I'd driven to the ocean for the first time since our divorce was finalized. The beach was nearly empty, just a few joggers and dog walkers enjoying the sunset. I sat on a piece of driftwood that had been worn smooth by years of waves, thinking about how different my life looked now compared to 6 months ago. 6 months ago, I'd been married to a man I thought I knew, living in a house that felt like a showcase, pretending that everything was fine while my world crumbled around me. I'd been isolated, manipulated, and systematically defrauded by someone who'd promised to love and protect me. Now I was divorced, living alone, and watching my ex-husband face criminal charges for crimes I'd helped uncover. The isolation had been replaced by a growing network of supportive friends and professional colleagues. The manipulation had been replaced by clarity about my own worth and judgment. The financial fraud had been replaced by careful control over my own resources. The old me might have felt guilty about Ethan's situation. The old me had been trained to prioritize his feelings over my own reality, to make excuses for his behavior and blame myself for noticing inconsistencies. But the woman sitting on that beach felt no guilt at all. Justice wasn't revenge. It was simply the truth being acknowledged by people with the power to act on it. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a moment, I wondered if Ethan had somehow gotten access to a phone from jail, if he was going to try one more manipulation to convince me to help him. But the message was from someone unexpected. "Hi Val, this is Marcus Webb. Wanted you to know that Detective Lopez mentioned you might be interested in victim advocacy work. There's a nonprofit that helps financial abuse survivors document their cases. They could use someone with your research skills. No pressure, just thought you might want to know the option exists." I'd stared at that message for a long time, watching the waves roll in and out with hypnotic consistency. The idea of helping other women navigate the same nightmare I'd lived through felt both terrifying and compelling. Terrifying because it meant reliving trauma, compelling because it meant transforming that trauma into something useful. The skills I'd developed during my investigation, systematic documentation, financial analysis, pattern recognition, were exactly what other victims would need. More importantly, I understood the psychological manipulation that made financial abuse so devastating. I'd experienced the gaslighting, the isolation, the gradual erosion of confidence that made victims doubt their own perceptions. 3 weeks later, I'd attended my first training session with the Financial Abuse Recovery Network. The conference room was filled with women of all ages, all backgrounds, all united by the experience of discovering that someone they'd trusted had been systematically stealing from them. Financial abuse is one of the most underreported crimes in domestic relationships, the facilitator explained during orientation. Victims often don't realize it's happening until significant damage has been done, and even then, they frequently lack the documentation needed to prove it in court. The statistics were sobering. Nearly 99% of domestic violence cases included financial abuse, but fewer than 20% of victims ever reported it to authorities. The shame, confusion, and fear that characterize financial abuse made it one of the most hidden crimes in America.
6 months after Ethan's sentencing, I'd moved into a new house. Not bigger or more expensive than the bungalow I'd been renting, but mine in a way that felt different from any home I'd shared with someone else. The mortgage was in my name alone, paid for with money I'd earned through my victim advocacy work and the freelance design business I'd rebuilt from scratch. The house came with a garden that had been neglected by the previous owners. I'd spent weekends pulling weeds and planting vegetables, discovering that I enjoyed the physical work of creating something growing and useful from soil that had been ignored. The garden became a metaphor for my own life, taking something that had been damaged and nurturing it back to health. My phone rarely rang with unknown numbers anymore, but when it did, on a Sunday morning in late spring, I answered with the confidence of someone who no longer feared what strangers might want to tell her. Miss Thompson? The voice was young, nervous, familiar in the way that all victim voices sound similar when they're taking the first step toward asking for help. "This is Val," I said, settling into the chair I kept in my garden for phone calls that required my full attention. "My name is Rebecca Martinez. I got your number from the Financial Abuse Recovery Network. I think my husband has been stealing from our business, but I don't know how to prove it, and everyone thinks I'm just being paranoid." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. Rebecca's story had different details, but the same pattern: missing money, suspicious explanations, gaslighting designed to make her doubt her own perceptions. By the time we hung up, we'd scheduled an in-person meeting, and I'd begun mentally reviewing the evidence-gathering checklist I'd refined through dozens of similar cases. That evening, I'd sat in my garden, watching the sun set over tomato plants I'd grown from seeds, thinking about the strange mathematics of justice. Ethan had stolen $400,000 and 5 years of my life. In return, I'd gained a career that felt like purpose, a home that belonged entirely to me, and the knowledge that I was strong enough to uncover any truth, no matter how carefully hidden. The woman who'd sat alone at a restaurant table, wondering why her family had abandoned her birthday celebration, was gone. The woman who opened her laptop in a courthouse parking lot to watch her ex-husband's live-streamed arrest had been a bridge between who I'd been and who I was becoming. But the woman who sat in her own garden, preparing to help another survivor document the theft of her reality, she was someone I'd never imagined I could be. Stronger, clearer, unafraid of empty chairs or silent phones or the truth that lived in bank statements and credit card bills. Someone who understood that the opposite of being deceived wasn't being suspicious. It was being confident enough in your own perceptions to trust what you observe, document what you discover, and act on what you knew. Rebecca's case would take months to build, just like mine had. There would be suspicious bank statements to analyze, financial records to organize, patterns to document. There would be moments when she'd want to give up, to accept the explanations that made her feel crazy rather than continuing to gather evidence that proved she was right. But she wouldn't be doing it alone. None of us had to do it alone anymore. The next morning, I'd received an email from the prosecutor's office. Ethan was requesting a reduction in his sentence, claiming that his crimes had been driven by gambling addiction and that he deserved consideration for his willingness to plead guilty. I deleted the email without finishing it. Whatever Ethan wanted now was irrelevant to the life I was building, the work I was doing, the woman I'd become in the aftermath of his betrayal. He'd lost the right to my attention when he'd chosen to celebrate our divorce with champagne purchased with stolen money, while live streaming his contempt for the woman he'd spent 3 years defrauding. Justice had been served, not with the dramatic satisfaction of watching him arrested on camera, but with the quiet accumulation of evidence, the patient work of building cases, the steady transformation of pain into purpose. The handcuffs clicking around his wrists had been just one moment in a longer story about reclaiming power from people who'd mistaken kindness for weakness. The real victory was sitting in my garden on a Sunday morning, answering calls from women who needed to know they weren't crazy, helping them understand that financial abuse was a crime with solutions, not a personal failing that required forgiveness. Ethan had celebrated too early and too publicly, mistaking the end of our marriage for the end of consequences. But consequences, like justice, work on their own timeline. They arrive when the evidence is gathered, when the truth is documented, when someone finally says enough and means it. The champagne cork that had popped at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon had marked the beginning of his downfall,
not his liberation. The woman watching from a courthouse parking lot had already won by then. She just hadn't told him yet.